uncle spoke these words in Esther chapter 4, verse 13 and 14. Then Mordecai commanded to answer Esther, "Think not with thyself that thou shalt escape in the king's house more than all the Jews. For if thou altogether holdest thy peace at this time, then shall their enlargement and deliverance arise to the Jews from another place. But thou and thy father's house shall be destroyed." Basically, he's saying, don't think at all that you're going to escape just because you're living in the palace. Then these were the monumental words. "And who knoweth whether thou art come to the kingdom for such a time as this?" Mordecai told her in simple words that basically, I believe that God put you in this place not just to be the queen, but to save his people. So, for the topic this evening, it's kind of interesting. I was going to share something about the brain and miraculous parts of the brain and have a fancy brain up here or something. And anyway, God steered my brain in a different direction. And it's a topic that I've wanted to share for a long time. I just really never had the push to do it. And so recently, when we were in Missouri, did our crazy little travels, to Missouri for that family reunion, a lot of history was spoken about my grandfather and some of the things that he went through. And since then, Ruth was, I shouldn't say bugging me, but she was nudging me gently and saying that maybe it's time to speak. So with God's help, I want to share briefly, well, I don't know how briefly it will be, but share some of basically a little bit of a glimpse of what he went through in his lifetime, and the history of how our free Christian day schools came about. How many of you have heard any history of how we have come to the place where we can have this free right? Okay, very well. What year was that case? That's okay. Put you on the spot again. So before we even get there, I want to actually give a window into my grandpa's backstory. And I feel like just in Esther's situation, some of the things that happened early in my grandfather's life helped set the stage for when he faced the pressure and the trials that he did in the late 1960s. So, forget the year my grandfather was born, but it was like 1913, I think, in March. Grandpa was born in Kokomo, Indiana, and he weighed all of 3 pounds at birth. Very tiny baby, if you will. From the beginning, Grandpa had a lot of health issues. He had issues with his hearing at a very young age, even as a baby. A lot of problems with that, and later on actually developed a heart murmur as well. And by the way, by way of interest, Back then, they actually used to go to real doctors that didn't Google everything, to see how to fix you. They actually gave you a good prescription. Do any of you want to guess what they prescribed Grandpa as a young boy to help his heart murmur? Now, some of you chocolate lovers are going to love this. The doctor told Pops, which that's what my grandpa always called his dad, was Pop. Grandpa told Pop Dottie, he said, now you go home and you give that boy all the dark chocolate that he wants. And he did. He said, we stopped at the grocery on the way home, and Pop Dottie got a big old bar of dark chocolate, and that was the prescription, and it was the remedy. So I can even remember late in Grandpa's late years, he would live with us up here in Union Grove, him and Grandma, and he would still, at times, he would buy dark brown sugar in a bag, and sometimes he would just put a spoonful of dark brown sugar in a cup and stir it up and drink it. That way, that was his little, still working on that. So anyway, so some of you are probably thinking, wow, wish I could find a doctor that tells me to eat more chocolate. So anyway, but a big thing here in this time was Grandpa school years is kind of what I wanted to touch on here as well, is his time at school. He only ended up with a 5th grade education. He did 1st grade 2 times, 2nd grade 1 time, 3rd grade 2 times. I'm not sure about 4th grade, but sometime between 4th and 5th grade, they changed schools. This was still in the Kokomo, Indiana area. They changed schools. And he was often accused by his teachers, you're just playing dumb. You're just being dumb. You're stupid. And, they would talk down on him. And they changed schools, and this new teacher was not having it. You're just being dumb. You're just doing this on purpose to get attention and yada, yada, the row. And he gets sent to the principal's office one day for, who knows what, a punishment of some kind. What was the principal going to do, right? Goes to the principal's office, and I still can hear Grandpa telling this story. He got in there and he was scared because he had enough abuse up to that point, sharp raps on the head with a ruler or whatever it may be, so he wasn't sure what was coming. And he goes to the principal's office, and he's like, the door closed behind him, and he was wondering, how can I get out of here? And the last thing he remembers is the principal walking up to him with a club in his hand. And the next thing he knows, he's waking up and he's on the floor and he has a headache. The principal beat him on the head so hard that it knocked him out, and he put a big old knot on his head. And when he woke up, the principal was gone, and he was in the room by himself. And he sits up, he's kind of, coming back to and seeing stars, and said, I'm getting out of here. So the door wasn't locked, so he gets out the door, runs a mile across the cornfield to home. And Pop Dottie is like, why are you home? And he told him, and he showed him the knot that was forming on his head. And Pop Dottie said, you're not going to go to school. You're not going to go to school anymore. So a couple days went by, and Well, Jonas Yoder didn't go to school. So guess what happened? The headmaster of the school came around trying to figure out why Jonas Yoder isn't in school. That's what they did back then. And so he shows up at the door, and he's he's hoeing sweet corn because Pop said you're not going to go to school. By this time, I forget, I wouldn't know exactly the age that he would have been. And so great grandpa called him in, and they sat down in the living room with the schoolmaster. And the schoolmaster said, "So, why are you not in school?" And Pop Duddy said, "Well," he said, "if you can explain to me why the principal would beat my son on the head with a club so hard that it knocks him out, puts a knot on his head, then I'll send my son back to school." But he said, if I'm going to have to send my son back to school, then we're also going to have to report the principal. And the schoolmaster said, "Well, Mr. Yoder, you are free from school." Told him he doesn't have to come back anymore. So, case dismissed. Anyway, stop and think about that for a minute. How many of you could ever imagine that kind of thing happening in our Christian day school today? Now, I would imagine if Brother Zach would perform such a task, it wouldn't be long until probably Joe and Evan and myself would probably be knocking on his classroom door. But just let that sink in. Like, if that would even happen in any school today, guy would go to prison. I 100% would. So that ended Grandpa's school years. I'm going to fast forward really far. Even my cousins and my uncles and aunts and my mom would even say that even later on, when Grandpa and Grandma had children and grandchildren, some of the ones that lived really close to Grandpa's, if you ever came home with homework and you couldn't figure it out, like you were stuck, and you just go to Grandpa, "Hey, I need some help." And Grandpa would say, "Okay." And he'd think a little bit and he'd say, "It's 25. Or he'd roll an answer off, and it was right 100% of the time. They said, never fail. If Grandpa gave you an answer, you put it on the paper because it was going to be right. Now, he couldn't always tell you how he did it. He couldn't like explain the steps how he did it, but his answer was right 100% of the time. But anyway, so be it. Later, the great-grandpas moved out of Kokomo, Indiana, and then the rest of Grandpa's growing up years would have been in Plain City, Ohio. That's where him and my grandma met. And I don't think I'm misquoting this, but I think they dated all of 2 weeks and were married. And they live happily ever after. So I guess that can work if that's what you want to do. But then in the late 60s, Plain City went through a big shift with the Amish. There was a big Amish community there. Then in the early to mid 60s, there was a big Beachy movement that went through Plain City, and a lot of the Amish were leaving and joining the Beachy church. And a lot of the relatives, like Grandpa's family, a lot of those relatives were leaving the Amish and going to the Beachy Church. And for that reason, Grandpa wasn't comfortable with that. And so he decided to move his family out. And that's when they relocated to New Glarus, Wisconsin. Little did he know that a few short years later, he would be involved in one of the most monumental cases in history. Can you get this thing turned on, and we'll get started here. Okay. So this case began in 1968. And so I'm going to just be rolling. Some of these first few pages are just information of the case. Obviously, it has the overview. It's a fairly legal-ish document. So it gives the three fathers that were involved. Now, the only reason that Grandpa was named on the case is because at that time, he was the head of the board. He was the chairman, so therefore he was the spokesperson. And then, so it was Wisconsin versus Yoder, Miller, and Yutzi, but it was named as Wisconsin versus Yoder due to he being the chairman of the board. And also, they were the three fathers who had children that brought this case about. What was happening is that in Wisconsin, their required age for schooling was 16 years old. Well, the Amish graduated at 8th grade. Okay, so that was a little bit of an issue because the head schoolmaster at that time was created a problem with that. So obviously we know kind of how we operate, how the Amish operate. We believe that it was a vocational school. After 8th grade, you did vocational school. So you go learn a trade. You go to carpentry, you farm with dad, whatever it is. That's the way they did. So the next year, when Frida, by the way, Christina knows this lady, Frida and let me get the back up here to the previous. When Frida, Barbara, and Vernon did not show up in school the next year, I don't know if you all know how the system works, but when back then, the state's contribution to the school was based on attendance. So by these three children not continuing education past 8th grade into high school, it made the school lose almost $18,000 in state funding. And that was the biggest issue. So the schoolmaster made a big deal out of it. So the school district administrator, I hope all of you can read this well. I had a couple of these other learning points of PowerPoint. I had a lot of this stuff enlarged and whatever, and I forgot to save my work, so it went back to original. So please forgive me. Hopefully you can read it up here. So the district administrator filed a formal complaint against the three fathers because of that loss in funding. All three of these fathers were charged, tried, and convicted in the Greene County, Wisconsin court for violating statute 118.15. And they were fined, each of the fathers were fined $5. Now I want you to remember that for a little bit. The first court was what I just mentioned. Like I said, they were all fined $5, but none of the three fathers ever paid the $5 fine. Because if they would have, that would have been an admission of guilt. So they never paid that. And something my uncle told me when I was on the phone with my uncle for a while to make sure I have some of these facts right. So I think it was years after that this was still on Grandpa's record, that this $5 court fine was not paid. And somebody just within the court, just went and paid the $5 so it would get off his record. I don't know if they did that for Miller and Yutzi or not. Okay. So here's another thing that I would like to do to set the stage just a little bit before we dive too deep in these court cases. One reason that this was such a touchy case is that even before 1972, there were so many cases left and right, from Pennsylvania all the way to Kansas. There were cases coming up that were being shot down by courts all the time. Indiana, 1921. LaGrange County took legal action against 11 Amish fathers. And then in Ohio in 1922, 5 Amish men were arrested because of school. Pennsylvania, from the late 40s to 1955, this was probably one of the most severe conflicts. Let's see, there was also some jail time there. And one editorial in the Intelligencer Journal in February 8th of 1955 put it this way: "It can be hoped that the solution will end once and for all the senseless prosecution of a fine, hard-working group of our fellow Countians, and that they once again will be able to till the soil and conduct their homes in full agreement with the law of their land, the dictates of their conscience, and most importantly of all, the tenets of their religious beliefs." So there were even people within the county that were just wishing that all this nonsense would stop. In Iowa in the mid-60s, this was right after Pennsylvania. So I don't know if some of you remember that image of these children fleeing the schoolhouse, running into the cornfield. Some people call it the cornfield case. That was in this time. Kansas in the 1966 was just 6 years before this. In a lot of these cases, fathers were actually fined and jailed for what happened. Something that I would say is noteworthy to mention is that even though that these 3 men were fined, they were never jailed. And here's something else to think about, is that why so few of these disputes were ever fully litigated is because of this. It's because the Amish did not believe in going to court to settle disputes, instead following the biblical command to turn the other cheek, which puts them at a slight disadvantage when it came to defending themselves in courts or before legislative committees. So that's why a lot of these things were just, they were constantly, the courts were crashing these Amish communities for their schools, etc. So, but then we'll get into what changed then with this Wisconsin case. So after so this first case here in Greene County happened in 68. So we're basically right after this last case in Kansas in 1966. So only 2 years later, this thing came up. So the parents appealed the case, and it went to Wisconsin Circuit Court, and the Circuit Court said, we're going to uphold Greene County, so sorry. So the parents appealed again, and I'm not sure I don't have all these facts. At what point did William Ball, the defense attorney, come in on the scene? But William Ball got a hold of these three men and said, I would like to represent you. Because he understood he was an attorney for religious freedom, and so he volunteered to take up this case. From the get-go, William Ball's goal was not to make this about school and children and parents. From the beginning, William Ball's goal was to make this an issue of violating religious freedom. So remember that, because that was one of the key things that actually turned the case in favor of the Amish. So, after the Wisconsin Circuit Court, the parents appealed the case again. So this is the second time that they lost, essentially. And so then, therefore, it goes to Wisconsin Supreme Court. And by the way, the parents did not have to go to all these courts. I know they were in a few, but not all. Wisconsin Supreme Court ruled in favor of the parents. So, first win. As they said that the state failed to show its interest in education and overrides free exercise rights. And then the state of Wisconsin then appealed and took it to U.S. Supreme Court. They asked for a certiorari, which is basically, they asked the U.S. Supreme Court, please review our documents, make sure that we are, this is legit, and the Supreme Court agreed to take the case and go from there. So, in the Supreme Court, the prosecuting attorney was John Calhoun, and then the attorney for religious liberty was William Ball, along with Joseph Skelly. I don't know how many of you know how courts work, but something noteworthy to mention in here is that throughout the court session in the U.S. Supreme Court, I think there's 4 recesses. The way it works, 3 or 4 sessions, 3 recesses, maybe something like that. But the way I understand it is after the first, like before each recess, they take a general consensus of how the justices are feeling about the case. Before the first recess, the justices were all in favor of Wisconsin. Before the second recess, all the justices were in favor of Wisconsin. Before the third recess, all the justices were still in favor of Wisconsin. I think I'm quoting that correctly. The 2 attorneys looked at each other and said, "We lost." I actually, if I have this right, I'm not sure that William Ball was actually in the courtroom, but the note was given to him that we've lost. Okay, now in the last session, they reviewed something that happened in the very first court hearing. So my mom's sister, Frida, she would have been the child that was affected. So to understand this, before you go diving into this and reading it, there was one thing that the prosecuting attorney was sure that he's got the Amish on. And it was that this is not a matter of religious freedom. This is a matter of the parents are trying to force the child to stay at home from school. You get what I'm saying? Like, they were looking at it that the child probably wants to go to school, but you're making him stay at home and work. So that's what he was trying to do. So therefore, that's where this testimony becomes so powerful. So the prosecuting attorney calls my aunt to the stand, and asked her, "So I take it then, Frida, the only reason you are not going to school and did not go to school since last September is because of your religion." This was cross-examination at this point because they had already questioned Grandpa. They had already questioned the other men. So this is coming to cross-examination. And Frida responded with a simple yes. But then I had all the wording of her complete testimony in here, and when I didn't save my document, it erased it, went back to the original. So I'll quote it the best I can. And I want you to notice something. How many of you have ever been in a situation? Let me ask it this way. How many of you have ever been in a court? You had to testify? Okay. So, how many of you knew exactly what you were going to say when you went to the stand? How do you prepare for that? Right? So, I think this is where Matthew chapter 10, verse 19 comes into play, that don't worry about how you are going to answer a man. And so, furthermore, after this, Frida said that as a 15-year-old Amish girl, in her simple language, she said, "I believe that if I were to go to high school, it would actually hinder her own religion." And she felt that if she went to high school, that it would hinder her from going to heaven. Okay, while some of us look at that statement and we're like, wow, that's pretty simple. But think of three things. In that statement, she mentioned three things that were of concern to her. She said, "I feel like it's a hindrance to me and my faith. It is a hindrance to my religion, and it could also be a detriment to my salvation." Okay. At that time, a lot of the public schools were teaching things that in the higher education, in the high schools, were teaching things that the Amish people did not feel was sound doctrine for their children. So, do you really blame them? I know, there's a lot of high school offered today, more on a Christian-based high school. Would I have a problem with high school today? Absolutely not. And I will just say that for the record, but back in those days, there was really not a Christian alternative to high school, and that's why they were so against it. Okay, this simple testimony here was used, so the other two children were never asked to testify, only Frida. So neither side called for any more witnesses. So this testimony went all the way to the Supreme Court. And after that third recess, they went back and reviewed again this statement. And that's when they said, so remember, when they went to the third recess, they were all still in favor of Wisconsin. When they came back from recess, things changed. They looked at this statement again and they said, you know what? By her testimony, this has nothing to do with, let me make sure I can find it. So the ruling was 6-1, and we'll get to that here in a little bit. Making sure that I have my stuff here. All right. The main reason for Chief Justice, or not Chief Justice, but Justice Douglas's dissent was because of this thing where he was one of the ones that felt like it was parents were just trying to force their children. So when he reviewed again this testimony, he said, crucial, however, are the views of the child whose parents is the subject of the suit. Religion is an individual experience. So he basically said that Frida's testimony matches that of her dad's, and he could tell that it came, it was personal for her. I think they were fully expecting something like, well, I'd rather go to school and all this and that and the other, never expecting that this testimony was going to be this personal. So that became a huge, huge deal. Some of the concurring or the key reasons were also when they came back and voted, and everything voted as, to pass in favor of the Amish. Reason number one was that they saw a long-standing tradition. The Amish demonstrated a sincerely held religious tradition, not a recently, it wasn't anything new. They had a background of, of history to help the courts see that, hey, they are what they say. It was a viable alternative. Their vocational school, continuing informal vocational education within the community, was adequately preparing these children for adult life. Okay? And as I mentioned earlier, the Wisconsin high school curriculum was found to conflict directly with Amish values, threatening both salvation and communal survival as sincerely believed. And then a narrow exemption, the ruling was tied to the Amish community's specific demonstrated facts, not just a general right of any parent to trying to opt out of schooling. So those were some of the points along with the testimony that actually helped rule in favor of the Amish. So some of the concurring opinions were from Justice Potter Stewart, joined by Justice Brennan, said they concurred separately and emphasized just how narrow the ruling was meant to be. Justice Brian White, joined by Brennan and Stewart, he emphasized that the decision rested on the community's unique demonstrated record, not just educational requirements in general. Now, this is where we come in. I actually read some of this, so we'll skip over it. Now, what did that case do for the future? Before we go too far into there, after the case was won in 1972. Now, this is interesting because Joseph Skelly had communicated with Ball and said, we lost. Because before the third recess, when they were all still ruling in favor of Wisconsin, they thought they completely lost the case. So, there was some communication there, and then there was communication to Grandpa, basically, hey, we pretty much lost the case. And so Grandpa was thinking that we lost the case. It was 10 days. This is 1972. They didn't have cell phones. They barely had any landlines. Right? It was 10 days before Grandpa ever found out that the Amish had won the case. So he spent 10 days, and this was one of his concerns, was how are we ever going to pay for this? Because he knew that if they lost the case, they're going to have to come up with money to pay for, all these legal fees and yada, yada. And so one day he got a hold of William Ball, and they were talking, and one of his first questions was, who's going to pay? And William Ball told him, said, Jonas, he said, there's a lot of religions out there that are helping to pay for this. He said, basically, that you don't owe a thing. And he said, all the religions that benefited from this are paying for this, in that sense. So that was quite interesting to note that here it was that long after. So some of the things that actually have helped since this case has closed in 72. What has it done? I'll just read this so I don't misquote it. It set a foundational precedent because the majority tied its holding closely to the Amish community's demonstrated history. The courts have applied it narrowly, declining to extend a similar exemption absent from comparable facts. Now, this case actually today still remains to be a cornerstone of free exercise clause cases. Now I understand that's a big word there, and I didn't really look up what is actually free exercise clause case. Like, what is that? But this case is cited widely in debates over parental rights. It's used in religious liberty and the limits of state authority over education and child rearing and child training, basically. So it's still very much a recognized case. Still today, when you study law, and they study specifically for religious freedom, this is the case that they study. It's quite interesting that, it's not just used for us in our situation. They actually use this case to study law. Now, going forward from there, the case has still drawing criticism, including from within Amish advocacy circles, over whether it adequately protected the individual futures and choices of Amish children. And this actually is, it reflects a little bit on Justice Douglas's dissent. Whose voice should count when religion, parenthood, and a child's own future come together? So maybe that's something that you need to ponder. Whose voice matters when religion, parenthood, and a child's future come together. That's as far as that goes. It was something else that was interesting to me is, now I don't know that any of you would have ever met my grandpa. I think Vernon would have, but this case for Grandpa was not very joyful. It was a work that needed to be done, and it got done, but something, Grandpa was very sensitive about his name being plastered all over the case, because people thought, oh, now he's famous. Mr. Yoder is famous now. No, he would have rather, he even said it in his own words. I don't have the quote with me tonight, but he mentioned that he would rather that his name could be wiped from the case so that it doesn't make him look like a hero. That was his wish. Obviously, it doesn't happen that way. He was very cautious about who he spoke to about the case, because there again, he didn't want his name to be lifted up. For 3 years after this case was closed, they had, when they still lived in Wisconsin, they had news reporters showing up at their doorstep, unannounced, uninvited, for 3 years. Anywhere from Florida to Ohio, Pennsylvania, California, all over the U.S., coming to interview Mr. Yoder. And they would come in the dead of winter. They would come in the heat of summer. It didn't matter. We could keep talking. There was a few interesting incidents that I found out in this last family reunion of these people that were showing up. There were people that would show up in the dead of winter, and mind you, this is New Glarus, Wisconsin. They had temperatures of -40 below. And he said this one, they were telling us the other week that there's this one man from California shows up, and they had like 12 or 15 inches of snow that had just fallen like the day before. It was in the way down into negatives, and this man comes out, and he's not dressed for New Glarus, Wisconsin. He's dressed for California. And he had these little slippers on, his tight jeans, and he didn't even have a coat, just had this light jacket. And he hops out of the car, and he comes to the barn, and they're out in the barn, Grandpa and the 3 boys. And he starts asking Grandpa questions, and one of the first things that Grandpa would do is, because these guys would try to trick him, he would say, okay, before we go any further, reach into your pocket and turn off your recorder. Because he knew these guys would be recording him. And so this guy reaches in, he turns off the recorder and proceeds to take notes. They're in the barn, no heat. This is 30 below. And this man is like just shaking like crazy, like trying to take notes. And they keep, can't we just go to the house? It'll be a little warmer. And Grandpa said, if you want to interview me, like, we're right here in the barn. We're working in the barn, so we're going to stay right here. And he keeps asking questions, and he's shaking so badly that he couldn't even get his notes down. Well, after about 20 minutes, this guy's done. And he gets out there to get in the car. They just had 15 inches of snow, and the car is stuck in the barnyard driveway. So they push him out, and he hops out and thank you, and jumps in his car again, and he's stuck again. So they push him out again. It happened like 3 times. And finally they said, look, you get in your car, when you get you moving, you keep on going. And so they got that guy out of the way. Man, I have to stop somewhere, but I'll tell you one more. Another one. So another reporter showed up one day. I think Grandpa was gone, and the 3 boys, they were just little shavers. So remember, this is 72 to 75-ish. And these, my 3 uncles, are school-age boys. So they find stuff very comical. And they had a big Siberian Husky. And that thing was so big, they would ride it. They would put a saddle on this dog and they would ride it. So just to give you an idea how big this dog was. One day, this car pulls up and the boys are sitting on the front porch. This guy drives up and the Siberian Husky, I think his name was Pepper, he's looking at the car and they said, boys said, watch him, Pepper. And the dog hops up. Before the guy even has a chance to get out of the car, he's like, runs out there to one side of the car, and he's like, sticks his nose right up there to the window, looking at the guy. And the guy's like, looking at him this way. And then, so he's like leaning way over, and Pepper runs around to the other side, looking at him, and he leans the other way. After about 5 rounds of that, the guy never got out of his car, just turned around and left. So they said they don't know where he came from. But anyway, they had incidents like this all the time for 3 years. Can you imagine? And I think that's actually one of the reasons why it was almost painful, in a sense, for Grandpa to talk about the case. I don't think I'm going too far in quoting this as well, but Grandpa never really spoke too much of why they left New Glarus, Wisconsin, but this case also created a little bit of turbulence within the church because people, you know how Amish and Mennonites, we kind of tend to get jealous when we see people get, a little bit of fame. There were people that had this idea that, Grandpa got a lot of money for winning this case. It was not the case. And so it created a lot of disillusion and a bunch of things that were unnecessary. But anyway, we'll leave it with that. If you have any more questions, feel free to ask. I don't know, maybe somebody has a question right now. I don't want to take it too late here. We're already way over time. But if you have a question burning in your head, feel free to ask.
So this case really is, in our school right now, we're benefiting from it because of that.
100%. So one thing to understand is that there were Amish schools going before all this stuff, but they were prone to a lot of state scrutiny. States were charging them. So this basically made so that it's free for all. It has benefited the private schools. It has benefited homeschools. Even the Catholics are benefiting from this ruling because it has to do with freedom of religion and educating your own children. So it's not just the Amish and the Mennonites that benefited from this case. So I don't know how many of you know this song. Anybody? I would like to sing this song because I feel like I want the gist of this historical topic not to just be about the school case, but remember again what I asked at the beginning. Have you ever wondered why God put you in this bracket of time, and if there's something monumental He wants you to do? What if that time is now? So if you can sing along, I don't want to sing